So imagine it is the year 1806, right? You have this terrible, just completely persistent earache. So you go to the most advanced physician you can possibly find.
Which is already a pretty risky move in 1806, honestly.
Oh, totally. But you go and you sit down in this dark room, and this doctor approaches your head holding a rigid metal tube, this bizarre arrangement of tiny mirrors, and a literally open lit wax candle.
Right, just a burning flame right next to your hair.
Exactly. And he proceeds to just shove this hot, flickering contraption to the side of your head just so he can get a look inside your ear.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like something out of a medieval torture manual, but it was actually a massive medical breakthrough.
It really was. It was one of our very first just desperate attempts to solve a problem that we now take completely for granted. I mean, when you go into a modern clinic and a doctor effortlessly checks your ear with that tiny, clean, plastic-tipped light.
The endoscope, right?
Yeah, the otoscope. When they use that, you are benefiting from centuries of, frankly, terrifying trial and error.
Which is exactly what we are diving into today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore the wild 200-year history of how humans learn to look inside the living body.
It is a wild history, yeah.
And we are tracking that history through two tiny word endings that you see on medical charts literally everywhere. And those are dash scope and dash scopy.
Yeah, these two suffixes, they carry so much weight because whether you are studying for medical exam or you're trying to decode the paperwork for an upcoming procedure you have, or maybe you're just wildly curious about how doctors figured out what makes us tick without, cutting us wide open, the evolution of these words explains it all.
It really does. So let's start by laying down the grammar, because I found a metaphor in the notes that really helped me lock this in. It's essentially the difference between a shovel and the act of digging.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so both of these suffixes come from the Greek verb scopin, meaning to look at or to examine. The dash scope is the shovel. It names the physical instrument you hold in your hand, like the otoscope for the ear.
Right, and the dash scopy then is the digging. It names the action or the procedure of actually using that tool. So otoscopy is the physical exam of peering into your ear canal.
The shovel and the digging.
Exactly. And just to round it out, if you see the adjective form, dash sopic, like an endoscopic camera, that just describes something pertaining to the tool itself.
Right. It clarifies the terminology perfectly. But what really struck me reading through these sources is that every scope ever invented was built to overcome one fundamental biological wall.
The opacity of the human body.
Yes, the fact that we are not see-through.
Yeah. I mean, our eyes are incredible organs, but they cannot see around corners, and they definitely cannot see through solid tissue. For the vast majority of human history, the inside of a living person was essentially a black box.
You could only guess what was happening, right, based on external symptoms,
Right.
like a fever or a rash.
Exactly. So to truly diagnose a problem, you had this massive engineering hurdle. You had to physically relocate the vantage point of the human eye to somewhere it naturally cannot go.
Relocating the vantage point of the eye. I really love that phrasing because it highlights just how unnatural this whole endeavor is. And maybe that's why the history of looking inside the human body didn't actually start with doctors at all.
Far from it, actually. The oldest documented ancestors in the Scope family, they weren't looking at human tissue. They were looking up at the stars and down at pond water.
The telescope and the microscope.
Right. They were coined in the early 1600s by Dutch and Italian lens makers. You had figures like Hans Lippershey, a spectacle maker, and of course Galileo, who improved the magnifying tube to, discover the moons of Jupiter.
Which means the root word scoping was entirely outside of medicine for a while. But even when we started using it for biology, the pioneers were just total amateurs. Like I was reading about Anthony van Leeuwenhoek in the 1670s. This guy wasn't a physician or even a scientist. He was a cloth merchant in the Netherlands.
Yeah, a draper with absolutely zero university training who didn't even speak Latin.
Which was basically a requirement back then, right?
Oh, it was the absolute requirement for scientific discourse at the time. If you didn't speak Latin, you weren't a scientist. But he started grinding his own lenses simply because he wanted to see the quality of the threads in his textiles more clearly.
But then he got curious, like any good deep diver, and started pointing those lenses at other things, right? Like his own dental plaque.
Yeah, which is kind of gross, but amazing. He essentially melted glass rods to create these tiny, nearly perfect glass spheres. and they acted as incredibly powerful single lenses.
Oh, so not a tube with lenses on both ends, just one tiny sphere.
Right, and by holding these tiny spheres incredibly close to his eye and placing specimens on a little pin, he achieved magnification levels no one else had reached. He became the very first person in human history to observe bacteria, protozoa, and sperm cells.
He called them animalcules, which is just such a fantastic 17th century word, like little animals swimming in his plaque.
It's a great word. And he was observing the microscopic world centuries before germ theory would actually explain how these organisms cause disease. But his work proved a really vital concept. By relocating the eye's vantage point to a microscopic level, he revealed a completely hidden universe.
So we have astronomers looking at Jupiter and coloss merchants looking at dental plaque. It begs the question, when do doctors finally start looking inside us? Because going back to my total nightmare scenario at the beginning of the show, that was 1806.
Right, yes. 1806 marks the first real engineering strategy for looking inside a human cavity, and the strategy was redirecting light using rigid tubes. The pioneer here was a German physician named Philipp Bazzini.
Okay, the guy with the candle.
The guy with the candle. He built the device you described, which he called the Lichtleiter, or light conductor.
I cannot get past the open flame. He used a wax candle near a patient's ear, their throat, or, according to the sources, the urethra and rectum. I mean, how did he not set people on fire?
It was incredibly precarious. But he used a clever system of mirrors within a divided tube. So one half of the tube directed the candlelight down into the body cavity, and then the other half directed the reflected image back up to his eye.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, technically speaking, the very first true endoscope, even though the word endoscope didn't exist yet.
Well, I would assume the medical community would just hail this guy as a genius. Like, he figured out how to actually see inside a living patient.
You would think so, but no. The medical establishment, particularly the faculty in Vienna, absolutely despised him for it. They formally condemned his device.
Wait, really? Because of the fire hazard?
No, that's the wild part. The fire was a risk, sure, but their primary objection was that they criticized him for excessive curiosity.
That is baffling to me. Excessive curiosity. I mean, diagnostic curiosity is the whole point of medicine.
Right, but you have to understand the prevailing medical philosophy of the time. Medicine was still heavily influenced by this idea of external humors and holistic balance.
Blood for humors, bleeding people with leeches, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. So attempting to mechanically peer inside a living patient, it was seen as a moral overreach, like a kind of hubris. They genuinely believed a good doctor should be able to diagnose based solely on pulse, temperature, and external observation. Peeking inside was considered almost vulgar.
What a striking historical failure.
Yeah.
And tragically, Bazzini never even got to see his idea vindicated, did he?
No, he didn't. He died just 3 years later, in 1809, from typhus that he actually caught while treating his patients. It took almost 50 years for the medical community to catch up to what he was doing.
50 years?
Yeah, it wasn't until 1853 that a French surgeon, Antonin Jean Desormeaux, built a workable successor. He used a kerosene lamp instead of a wax candle, which burned a lot brighter and steadier. And Desormeaux is the one who actually coined the term endoscope and began using it routinely on living patients.
Wow, okay, so that officially brings the dash scope into mainstream medicine, so that covers light.
Yeah.
But while some doctors were trying to shove kerosene lamps down tubes, another physician was dealing with a completely different problem, which was sound. And this brings us to René Laennec in 1816, who invents the stethoscope. And I actually have a major issue with this one.
Oh, yeah. Let's hear it.
Well, if the Greek root scopein literally translates to look at or to view, why on earth is a stethoscope a tool explicitly designed for listening to the heart and lungs in the scope family? I mean, it feels like a massive misnomer.
It does seem totally contradictory at first glance, but it makes sense when you look at the fundamental problem Laennec was actually trying to solve. He was operating on a different sensory principle. He was relocating sound rather than light.
Okay.
See, Laennec realized that acoustic waves, they scatter and they lose their energy very quickly as they travel through the open air.
Which is why at the time, doctors just put their ears directly on a patient's chest.
Precisely. Direct contact bypassed the air. But Laennec found himself in this really delicate situation. He was examining a young woman with a heart condition, and due to the social mores of 1816 and honestly his own modesty, he felt it was totally inappropriate to place his ear flat against her chest.
So a major medical breakthrough was catalyzed by a doctor feeling a little socially awkward.
It really was. He remembered this acoustic trick, that solid or hollow columns trap sound waves and funnel them directly, preventing them from scattering, Think of, two kids talking through a string and tin cans.
Right.
So he rolled up a sheaf of paper into a really tight cylinder, pressed one end to her chest and the other to his ear.
And trap the acoustic
She
energy.
trapped it and funneled it straight into his ear canal. And he realized the sound wasn't just quieter than direct contact, it was actually much clearer and louder. He later refined that rolled up paper into a hollow wooden tube.
Wow.
And he earned the dash scope suffix because conceptually he was doing the exact same thing Bazzini did. He relocated the ear's vantage point to the inside of the chest, bypassing the insulating layers of skin and fat. He was essentially looking into the chest with his ears.
Okay, that reframes it perfectly. He was solving the same problem of biological opacity, just with a different sense. But sadly, looking at his biography and the sources, his story carries the same sort of grim irony as Bazzini's.
It does.
Yeah, he used his new wooden stethoscope obsessively to study the acoustic signatures of tuberculosis in the lungs, and then ended up dying of tuberculosis a decade later.
It's a really profound personal sacrifice for the sake of diagnostic clarity. But whether we are talking about Laennec's wooden tubes for sound or Disermo's metal tubes for light, all of these early scopes shared one massive, painful limitation.
They were completely rigid. They only worked in a straight line.
Right. I mean, imagine trying to examine the twisting pathways of the human stomach or the winding colon using a stiff metal pipe. It was intensely uncomfortable, often dangerous for the patient, and largely ineffective for deep internal anatomy. We desperately needed a way to see around corners.
Which brings us to the 1950s, and what I think is honestly the most mind-blowing technical leap in this entire story, which is fiber optics.
Without a doubt. In the 1950s, researchers in Britain, specifically Narinder Kapani and Harold Hopkins, they perfected fiber optic bundles. To understand why this changed medicine forever, we really have to look at the physics of something called total internal reflection.
Break that down for us, because sending an image through a bent string of glass sounds like magic.
It kind of does, but think of a fiber optic thread as a microscopic glass hallway. The glass is specifically coated so that its walls act like perfect mirrors. If you shine a laser down this hallway, the light doesn't pass through the walls. It bounces off them, sort of zigzagging its way down the corridor.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and even if you take that glass hallway and literally tie it in a knot, the light continues to bounce perfectly along the inside curves and comes out the other end totally intact.
So the camera no longer needs a straight line of sight. The flexible glass fibers can snake their way through the natural curves of the throat or the intestines, carrying the image back to the doctor's eye.
It was absolutely revolutionary. And the physician who truly brought this into the clinical world was a gastroenterologist named Basil Hershowitz in 1957. He built the very first flexible fiber optic gastroscope at the University of Michigan.
I have to pause on Hershowitz for a second, because the way he tested this is just legendary. I mean,
Yeah.
you build a 3-foot flexible glass tube and want to prove it's safe to slide down a human esophagus. How do you convince people? He literally swallowed it himself.
The ultimate self-experiment.
Unbelievable.
But he proved that the flexibility of the scope made it infinitely safer and just way more tolerable than the rigid metal pipes of the past.
But the sources point out something fascinating here. Here's where it gets really interesting. This fiber optic leap didn't just make things more comfortable for the patient. It fundamentally changed the very definition of what a dash scope could be.
Yeah, because of the space it freed up. Once you have a flexible bundle of tiny glass fibers transmitting the light and the image, you no longer need a wide, hollow metal tube just for viewing. You have extra room inside the casing of the instrument.
Right. And that extra room gave birth to the working channel. Because up until the 1970s, a dash scope was entirely passive. You look, you diagnose a problem, you pull the tool out, and then you schedule a massive open surgery to fix whatever you just saw.
Exactly. And the transition from a passive viewing tube to a multi-channel surgical platform, that is where modern medicine was truly born. I mean, a modern colonoscope, for example, is an absolute marvel of engineering.
It's like a Swiss Army knife.
It is. It has the fiber optic camera and light source, sure, but it also has a channel to shoot water and wash away debris. It has a suction channel to clear fluids, and most importantly, it has a hollow working channel where the doctor can thread down tiny robotic forceps, laser fibers, or wire snares.
This blew my mind. The instrument that only looks and the instrument that treats became the exact same thing. A prime example in the text is colonoscopic polypectomy. In the late 1960s, physicians William Wolfe and Hiromi Shinya figured out how to snake a wire snare down that working channel, loop it around a precancerous polyp in the colon, and just snip it off during the exam.
And that completely flipped the paradigm of cancer treatment. It turned a colonoscopy from a purely diagnostic procedure, merely finding out if you are sick, into a preventive one. They were interrupting the disease process and physically removing the threat before cancer could even develop.
Without ever cutting the patient's abdomen open.
Exactly.
Now, it sounds like a pure victory for medicine, but obviously, turning a flexible camera into a remote-controlled surgical workstation introduced some massive new risks. You can't just hand a surgeon a joystick and expect them to perform perfectly on day one.
No, you definitely can't. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you've hit on a really intense debate from the medical community regarding the learning curve. Let's look at the early 1990s when laparoscopic cholecystectomy, which is a gallbladder removal using a laparoscope, took the surgical world by storm.
The appeal is obvious, right? Instead of slicing someone's stomach open and keeping them in the hospital for a week, you make 3 tiny keyhole incisions, do the work with long instruments, and they go home the next day.
The benefits were undeniable. But as the procedure rapidly became the standard of care, surgical case studies began documenting this really terrifying trend. There was a temporary but very severe spike in major complications, specifically accidental injuries to the patient's bile duct.
Wait, hold on. I need you to clarify this for me.
Mhm.
Because these were master surgeons who had successfully removed hundreds of gallbladders the old-fashioned way. Why were they suddenly making these catastrophic mistakes just because the incision was smaller? Aren't they still just cutting the same tissue?
They are cutting the same tissue, yes, but the human-machine interface fundamentally changed. When a surgeon does an open surgery, their hands are directly inside the patient. They have 3D binocular vision, and they can physically feel the tension and texture of the organs with their fingers.
The tactile feedback.
Exactly. But with a laparoscopy, they are staring at a flat 2D television monitor. They have zero depth perception, and they cannot physically feel the tissue.
And the tools themselves operate weirdly, don't they?
Yes, because of the fulcrum effect. The abdominal wall acts as a pivot point for the long instruments. So if you move your hand to the left outside the body, the tip of the scissors moves to the right inside the body.
Oh, wow. It's like trying to tie your shoelaces using 3-foot-long chopsticks while looking through a peephole.
That is an excellent analogy. A endoscopy is not just a miniaturized version of an open surgery. It is a completely different physical language with entirely different failure modes. The spike in injuries happened because the medical field initially underestimated just how rigorous and specialized the retraining needed to be to master that new spatial awareness.
That makes total sense. It's a stark reminder that every technological leap has severe growing pains. And that tension between new technology and established methods is actually driving a major debate today, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The turf war right now isn't really about rigid versus flexible scopes anymore. It's about direct visualization versus indirect imaging. We see this most clearly in the debate over colon cancer screening.
Right. On one side, you have the optical colonoscopy we just talked about, where a gastroenterologist physically inserts a flexible fiber optic scope to look around. But on the other side, you have radiologists pushing for CT colonography, which is often called a virtual colonoscopy.
Yeah, and with a virtual colonoscopy, no scope actually enters the colon. The patient lies in a CT scanner, which takes hundreds of rapid X-ray slices. Then a computer stitches those slices together to create a highly detailed 3D digital fly-through of the colon that the radiologist just examines on a computer screen.
Radiologists argue this is incredible because it's far less invasive, much faster, and carries zero risk of physically puncturing the colon with a tool.
But gastroenterologists push back hard on that. They argue that while the CT scanner can see a polyp, it cannot touch it. If the virtual scan finds something suspicious, the patient still has to come back, get prepped all over again, and undergo a physical optical colonoscopy anyway to actually biopsy or remove the tissue.
Which provides a perfect pivot to clear up a sort of alphabet soup of medical terminology for anyone reading their charts. That debate perfectly illustrates the difference between dash-oscopy and dash-agraphy.
Precisely. A dash-oscopy implies live, direct visual or acoustic inspection by a human being in real time. The CT scan is a dash-agraphy or dashgram, like a mammogram or angiography. It produces a recorded, indirect image constructed by sensors without a direct eye on the physical tissue.
And what happens if the dash-oscopy finds something that needs to be permanently taken out?
That brings us to dash-actomy, which means surgical removal, like an appendectomy. If a surgeon just needs to cut into a structure to relieve pressure or access something, that's a dash-ostomy, like a tracheotomy. And if they need to create a brand new permanent opening that connects to the outside of the body, that's an astomy, like a colostomy.
Okay, that clears up so much confusion. Now, before we finish up, I want to tackle a few rapid-fire misconceptions about the scope that pop up in everyday life. Myth number 1. If your doctor says you need a -S-escopy, you're going to be knocked out with anesthesia for an invasive surgery.
That is a very common myth, but it's totally false. I mean, while procedures that enter sterile internal cavities, like a laparoscopy in the abdomen or an arthroscopy in the knee, those do require an operating room and sedation. But many spascopies take seconds and require zero painkillers. Otoscopy, looking in your ear, or ophthalmoscopy, shining a light at your retina, those are totally painless outpatient exams.
Myth number 2. The word microscopic always means something was examined in a lab under a medical microscope.
This is a fascinating case of a technical word drifting into popular culture. In everyday English, microscopic has simply come to mean extremely tiny. If someone says their apartment has a microscopic kitchen, they aren't implying a scientist analyzed it on a glass slide.
And finally, myth number 3. The -scope suffix is exclusively owned by the medical field.
Not at all. Medicine borrowed the root from astronomy, and general science just ran with it. You have the periscope on a submarine, the gyroscope balancing your smartphone, and the oscilloscope measuring voltage in an electronics lab. Even the kaleidoscope, which was invented by a Scottish physicist in 1816.
Wait, 1816, that is the exact same year René Laennec rolled up his paper stethoscope in Paris.
It is. The early 19th century was clearly a golden age for inventing new ways to capture light and sound.
So putting this all together, what does this mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about the deep history of a Greek suffix?
Because you interact with this legacy of human ingenuity constantly. Every time a pediatrician checks your child's ear infection with an otoscope, every time a nurse listens to your breathing with a stethoscope, or a family member gets a torn meniscus repaired through a tiny arthroscopic keyhole, you are benefiting from this specific history. We took the absolute limitation of human senses, the fact that we cannot see through skin, and we spent 200 years aggressively figuring out how to bypass it.
It is a stunning timeline when you lay it all out like that. We started with Dutch lens makers gazing at Jupiter. Then we moved to Philip Bozzini being completely ridiculed for pointing a literal wax candle down a metal pipe. We trapped and relocated sound waves with Laennec's wooden tubes. We mastered total internal reflection to bend light around corners with flexible fiber optics. And finally, we transformed passive viewing tubes into remote-controlled robotic workstations that can cure diseases in real time.
It is a massive triumph of problem solving. We learned how to project human perception and human action deep into the living body, changing the course of diagnostics forever.
It is a triumph, but it leaves me with one final thought, especially considering that modern turf war we talked about between the physical scope and the virtual CT scan. If this entire 200-year history has been a desperate quest to physically insert human senses inside the body, might the future of medicine bypass the physical scope entirely?
That is the ultimate question.
If virtual imaging, like CT scans and MRIs, gets so incredibly advanced that a computer can map and diagnose every single cell perfectly from the outside without ever breaking your skin, will the physical endoscope eventually become just as obsolete as Bozzini's dangerous candlelit tube? Could we be living in the final golden era of the physical endoscopy? It is definitely something to mull over the next time your doctor tells you they need to take a look inside. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions and keep looking deeper.